Yes, hello to you all once again, and another warm welcome back to your favourite classic dirt bike TV channel, where we continue to do our very best to try and unearth more of those old school vintage dirt bikes from way back in the day. Now, if you're a brand new subscriber to CDB TV, then welcome aboard, and I hope you continue to find material in here to entertain you with regards looking at these old vintage race bikes. And if you haven't already subscribed to my channel, then I do hope you will consider doing that small thing, because we do have some very nice bikes coming up in the next few weeks and months. So right now we're going to take a look at a bike that was a bit of an iconic machine in the mid 1960s, and some of the world's top riders rode these machines back in the day. So let's get straight into the video and take a look at Stewart Riddell's lovely 1965 Twinport 250 CZ. Now, as you're no doubt aware, CZ, or CZ as I know they now pronounce it over there in the States, initially began by manufacturing guns and armaments, and it was first established in 1919, and in its early years they produced pistols, air guns and automatic weapons that it then sold all over the world. And it would be that engineering excellence in the quality of these weapons that would be the initial building blocks for CZ to then go on and build these very high quality off-road racing motorcycles. Which conveniently brings us along to our featured bike here, which is a 1965 250 Twinport, which, as I remember, I think these were designated the Type 968 model, and this bike here belongs to Scottish rider Stewart Riddell, who actually bought this bike as quite a scruffy machine. And in these pictures here you can see that the bike at that time, it wasn't exactly the most glamorous motorcycle on the planet, but Stewart said the first time he saw the bike, it still looked like most of the parts were all intact, and so he made an offer to the vendor, which was then quickly accepted. Now, Stewart also told me at the time that he never even heard the bike running before he actually bought it, and it still had the old points ignition system fitted, and had a few other mechanical issues that needed looking at. But Stewart's intention, it was never to race the bike immediately anyhow, because he had his mind set on doing a full rebuild on the bike before even thinking about putting it on a racetrack. And that way, he said, he'd have a much better idea of what the bike was going to be like out on the racetrack, because he says first impressions are always the best indication of what a new bike is like to ride. And so naturally, as soon as Stewart got the bike home, he then set about it with the spanners and completely dismantled the bike down to its last nut and bolt. And what we're looking at here is the finished machine soon after Stewart completed its refurbishment. And I'll just try and talk you through some of the work and some of the parts that were fitted to this bike during that rebuild. So let's just start with the bike's chassis, which was first inspected for any signs of damage or cracks, and surprisingly the frame was in very good condition for a motorcycle chassis from the 1960s, and no serious faults were actually found. So it was then sent to Stewart's local paint shop to be sandblasted and then powder coated in black. Of course, the rear swing arm also underwent that very same sandblasting and painting treatment before being refitted back onto the chassis. Now again, as you'd expect, the engine was completely dismantled, and all of the motor's bearings, seals, etc. were all replaced, and Stewart also decided to fit a replacement set of gear clusters because the motor's gearbox originals had seen much better days, and there was quite a bit of wear and tear on the cogs after 50 odd years of use on the racetrack. Now the clutch again was also replaced with brand new plates because this once more had sustained major punishment after its years of racing, so it was then changed just to make sure that everything was good to go when that rebuilt engine was eventually fired up. Now, if you're of a certain age, then you may remember the story about the great Joël Robert, who rode one of these twin porters in 1964, and Joel was renowned for placing the heel of his boot on this clutch arm just to hold the clutch disengaged on the start line, when of course at that time riders used to do the old left hand on your helmet starts off the start line, and when the flag dropped, Joel would just then lift his boot off the casing and he was on his way. Although, as you know, this is where these twin porters get their title from, a single cylinder two-stroke barrel, but two exhaust ports with those low slung twin exhausts that go down either side of the bike. But during the motor's rejuvenation, the barrel on this engine was rebored in a brand new oversized piston, rings, conrod and small end were also fitted, which more or less made sure that most of the engine's important components were now all sound and in good condition. Although it was without doubt a quite radical idea to fit these twin exhaust ports into a single cylinder two-stroke engine, and whether it actually made a lot of difference over a standard single cylinder motor with a single exhaust port was actually debatable, but there's no denying that these twin porters certainly had the look, especially with those twin pipes that ran down either side of the bike. Now, as I said earlier, Stewart did tell me that when he first bought the bike, it still had the original 1965 points ignition system fitted, which was basically how these old two-strokers got their sparks back in the day. But as you know, those old points systems were not very reliable and a bit old-fashioned for their time, so Stewart then took the opportunity to upgrade that old system and fit a much more efficient and reliable CDI electronic unit, which makes the bike start and run much easier. But back in 1965, CZ fitted these old Jikov carburetors to these bikes, which, to be fair, did have a bit of a reputation for leaking and sometimes flooding, and many riders did replace them with a carb with a bit more quality, like maybe a Mikuni or something similar. But when these old Jikov carburetors were set up and working correctly, they still did a decent job, and that's probably why Stewart's decided just to stick with the original Jikov on his rebuilt machine. Although many of the engine parts and other components that were used to refurbish Stewart's twin porter all came direct from a very good source in the Czech Republic, and it was Jari Starek who actually used to work in the research and development department of the CZ factory, who supplied Stewart with many of the parts for this build, although some of the other little bits and pieces that Stewart couldn't locate in the Czech Republic, he then managed to pick them up from CZ specialist Gerard Coppings of CZ Stuff here in the UK. But these days it's a well-known fact that you're not going to be able to call your local CZ dealership and just order up a pair of exhausts for a 1965 250 Twin Porter, because original pipes are almost impossible to source as new old stock items, although there's still quite a thriving industry of small manufacturers over there in the Czech Republic who are still remanufacturing these pipes and other parts for these old bikes. And these twin expansion chambers on Stewart's bike are reproduction parts that have all been nicely chrome plated just to add a bit of bling to this quite rare Twin Port specimen. And actually one other factor regarding these Twin Port motors were that CZ did manufacture the engine casings in this sand cast magnesium just to try and reduce the weight of the bike. And back in the day, the front and rear brake drums were also made from that same type of casting. But even so, these Type 968 bikes were still relatively light at just over the 200 pounds mark, so it was quite a light machine to throw around a racetrack. So as we move on to the front end of Stewart's machine, now the front forks on the original bike were in a bit of a state, and the inner sliders had certainly taken a lot of abuse over the years, and they had various pits and other types of bomb damage on them. And so Stewart just sent these forks to his local engineering shop, where they were then remachined and re-chromed, and of course then rebuilt with brand new seals, etc. And they were almost as good as new when they were eventually bolted back onto the bike. Although it's said that these old school drum brakes on these Twin Porters were still pretty good for an older antique stopper, and as I said, because this was a reasonably light motorcycle, these drum systems were perfectly suited to this lightweight racer. And as I said, early stock versions of these 250s did have magnesium hubs on the front and at the rear, although I can't confirm that that is the case here on Stewart's 968. Now, as you'd expect, this 50-odd-year-old bike is never going to still have its original factory-fitted rear suspension units, and as I remember, I think it was more than likely that it would have been a pair of PAL or PAL shocks that would have been fitted at the factory in 1965. So Stewart, as you can see, has now fitted a pair of these JT Classic suspension units, which will be of much better quality and certainly perform better than those stock CZ originals. And once more, the original colour of this fiberglass fuel tank was red, of course, when Stewart first bought the bike, but because the stock Twin Porters in 65 are said to have had the blue fuel tank, Stewart then decided to paint it blue in keeping with the bike's year of manufacture and originality. Although the downside, of course, to having these older fiberglass fuel tanks is that they don't take too kindly to modern day fuels, and modern gas tends to eat away at the insides of these fiberglass fuel tanks if you leave fuel in them for long periods, which is why Stewart always drains down the tank after each race event. But I'd have to say that you could certainly never complain about the seats that were fitted onto these CZs, because they were renowned for being among some of the best and most comfortable seats on an off-road bike in the 1960s, but then I suppose that they would have had to have been to make up for that very limited suspension movement at the back of the bike. Now, once again, you've probably already guessed that both the front and the rear wheels on Stewart's 250 are brand new alloy replacements, because the original wheels that did come with the bike were in such a sorry state and much too far gone to be used on a new rebuild, and so Stewart's had these new rims relaced onto the original hubs, and thankfully he's left these rims in their nice shiny alloy, and Stewart's not been tempted to have them powder coated black, which seems to be the latest trend these days when people are rebuilding these old vintage classics. And so as we move on to the controls on Stewart's bike, we can see here that it's fitted with a pair of stock original 1965 CZ handlebars, and the easy way to identify those factory fitted bars is that they have the crossbar welded at both ends, but more importantly the hangers for both the clutch and front brake levers are also welded to the bars, which is quite unique to these old CZs. So this is a very good indication that you've certainly got yourself a proper factory set of CZ handlebars fitted onto your bike, and the chances are that these clutch and brake levers are also proper 1965 CZ parts from that era. Now again, almost certainly the front and rear mudguards are remanufactured items, which again replace the old and broken parts that were fitted to this bike when Stewart first purchased it. And as I said, these kind of parts for these old bikes are easy enough to come by nowadays, which makes these machines a very good proposition if you're looking for a bike to start classic racing. But to complete the bike from strip down to rebuild, it took Stewart just over 3 months to complete, and you have to admit that the transformation from that old clunker that he first bought to this superb looking specimen has certainly been a labour of love for Stewart. But as you know, it was the Belgian rider Joël Robert who made these twin porters famous when he won the World Championship on a similar bike to this in 1964. And then, of course, the great Russian rider Victor Arbekov did exactly the same thing on a twin porter in 1965. So as you can gather, for their time, these were pretty quick machines in 1964 and 65. Although this is certainly no show bike or concourse entry for the next shiny classic bike show, Stewart has certainly raced this bike regularly since its rebuild, and he also has quite a few other very nice Czech Republic CZ bikes in his collection, which I do hope to visit in the next few weeks to feature here on my channel. So if you like your old Czechoslovakian CZ dirt bikes, then hopefully you'll like some of the other examples that Stewart has to offer. Although you certainly have to say that in terms of their aesthetic looks, these twin porters with those double-sided exhausts are quite hard to beat as classic bikes go, and not only do they have that look, they're still extremely quick on the racetrack as well. So there you have it. I do hope you enjoyed that walk around Stewart Riddell's lovely 1965 250 Twin Port CZ. As I said, quite an iconic machine when these bikes came out in the 1960s, and they were quite radical as well with that single cylinder two-stroke motor with those twin exhaust pipes down either side of the bike. And some of the world's top riders did ride those twin porters way back in the day. So coming up next, we're going to take a look at another lovely machine that I came across at the 2022 Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show, and this particular 1979 440 Myco twin shocker was ridden and belonged to the great Roger Harvey, but this bike has now been fully restored for Roger to be reacquainted with the bike and to pick the machine up when he attended the 2022 Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show. So we'll have the full story on this bike when we return for the next time here on Classic Dirt Bike TV. So until the next time, everybody continue to be careful out there when you're riding those old twin shockers, and I hope to see you back here again very soon so we can talk about more of this old school vintage iron right here on your #1 and favourite Classic Dirt Bike TV channel.